Sometimes the people who look the smallest in the room are carrying the biggest ideas. 10-year-old Nia Carter repeated those words quietly to herself as she stepped off the city bus and looked up at the towering glass headquarters of Coleman Tech. The building seemed impossibly tall, its mirrored windows reflecting the bright morning sky above downtown Chicago. Employees in tailored suits moved quickly through the revolving doors, while black luxury cars lined the curb outside. For a moment, Nia tightened her grip on the worn navy backpack hanging from her shoulder. Compared to everyone around her, she felt invisible. But inside that old backpack was something she believed could help thousands of children. That thought gave her the courage to keep walking. Earlier that year, Nia had noticed a problem in her neighborhood. Many students wanted to learn coding, complete homework online, or explore technology, but their families could not afford expensive computers. Some children shared a single aging laptop with multiple siblings. Others relied entirely on public libraries. Instead of simply accepting the situation, Nia started asking questions. She interviewed parents. She spoke with teachers. She gathered statistics from community centers. She filled notebook after notebook with observations and ideas. Eventually, she created a proposal for a low-cost technology access program designed specifically for underserved communities. What began as a school project slowly became something much bigger. When her science teacher submitted the proposal to a youth innovation competition sponsored by Coleman Tech, neither of them expected Nia to be selected. Yet somehow she was. Now she was standing in front of the company itself. Inside the lobby, everything felt polished and expensive. Massive digital displays covered the walls. Employees carried tablets and laptops while discussing business meetings and investment reports. Nia felt several people glance toward her backpack before quickly looking away. She adjusted the strap and followed the signs leading toward the executive conference center. As the elevator climbed higher and higher, her stomach filled with nervous energy. The presentation would take place in front of executives, investors, and business leaders. She had practiced for weeks, but nothing could fully prepare her for what awaited behind those conference room doors. When the elevator opened, a receptionist greeted her and directed her toward a waiting area overlooking the city skyline. Several finalists sat nearby reviewing notes and presentation materials. Most appeared older than Nia. Some wore business attire. Others had professional-looking display boards and presentation cases. Nia quietly took a seat and opened her folder. The numbers she had gathered were still there. The research was still solid. The idea still mattered. Across the room, a television screen displayed an interview with Coleman Tech CEO Richard Coleman. He spoke confidently about innovation, leadership, and investing in the future. People admired him. Investors trusted him. Employees respected him. Today he would personally evaluate several finalists. Nia watched the screen and wondered what he would think of her project. A few minutes later, an event coordinator entered the room and announced that presentations would begin shortly. One by one, finalists gathered their materials and headed toward the executive conference suite. Nia stood slowly, adjusted her backpack, and took a deep breath. She had no idea that before the day ended, a single moment inside that conference room would change not only her future, but the future of the man everyone believed was untouchable. The executive conference suite was unlike anything Nia Carter had ever seen. Floor-to-ceiling windows stretched across one side of the room, revealing miles of Chicago's skyline beneath a bright blue sky. A polished table, nearly 30 feet long, occupied the center of the space. Around it sat investors, executives, consultants, and business leaders whose decisions influenced millions of dollars every year. Screens displayed presentation schedules while assistants quietly moved between seats distributing documents and refreshments. Nia felt her heartbeat quicken as she entered the room. Her worn navy backpack suddenly seemed even older among the expensive briefcases and designer portfolios surrounding her. Still, she kept walking. She reminded herself that ideas did not become less valuable simply because they came from unexpected places. One by one, finalists presented their proposals. Some discussed advanced software. Others proposed environmental technology or educational applications. The audience listened politely and occasionally asked questions. Nia carefully took notes while waiting for her turn. She noticed that Richard Coleman sat near the head of the table. The CEO carried himself with complete confidence. Whenever someone spoke, The room naturally looked toward him. His opinions clearly mattered. Investors often nodded after he commented. Employees watched him closely. He appeared to be exactly the kind of leader people expected to succeed. As the morning continued, Nia reviewed her presentation again. Inside her folder were community surveys, cost projections, and pilot program results collected over many months. She had worked after school, during weekends, and throughout summer break gathering information. Her proposal was simple. Instead of expecting families to purchase expensive technology, community technology hubs could provide affordable access to refurbished computers, educational software, and coding workshops. The numbers showed that the model could operate at a fraction of traditional costs. More importantly, children would gain opportunities many currently lacked. Eventually, the moderator called her name. Every conversation in the room stopped. Nia stood, adjusted the strap of her backpack, and walked toward the presentation screen. For a brief moment, she felt dozens of eyes studying her. She connected her materials and prepared to begin. Before she could speak, Richard Coleman glanced toward her backpack and raised an eyebrow. A few executives exchanged curious looks. Nia noticed but continued organizing her notes. She had learned long ago not to let appearances distract her from her goals. As the presentation timer appeared on the screen, she took a deep breath and looked toward the audience. Near the far end of the table sat a woman with silver hair and sharp, attentive eyes. Unlike many others, she seemed genuinely interested. Her nameplate read Eleanor Hayes. She had not spoken much all morning, but she observed everything. Nia appreciated that. The moderator smiled. "You may begin." Nia stepped forward and prepared to introduce her idea. But before the first slide could appear, Richard leaned back in his chair, folded his arms, and spoke loudly enough for everyone in the room to hear. The comment that followed would instantly change the atmosphere and reveal far more about the people in that room than anyone expected. For a brief moment, nobody spoke. Richard Coleman looked at the young girl standing beside the presentation screen and smiled in a way that made several people uncomfortable. Then he glanced at the worn navy backpack resting near her feet. "I have to admit," he said with a short laugh, "this may be the first investor presentation in company history delivered straight from a school backpack." A few nervous chuckles echoed around the table. Most people remained silent. Nia felt every eye in the room shift toward her. Heat rushed into her face. She had spent months preparing for this opportunity, yet within seconds the focus had moved away from her research and onto her appearance. Richard leaned back comfortably in his chair. "Tell me something," he continued. "Are you sure you are in the right room?" The words hung in the air. Nobody laughed this time. Several executives lowered their eyes. Others pretended to review documents. Nia stood completely still. She could feel embarrassment pressing against her chest, urging her to sit down and disappear. Part of her wanted to grab her backpack and leave immediately. But another part remembered every child she had interviewed, every parent who had shared their struggles, every student who had told her they wished they had access to better technology. If she walked away now, those voices would disappear with her. Richard seemed to interpret her silence as surrender. "This meeting is usually reserved for serious proposals," he said. "We have investors from all over the country here today." Nia tightened her grip on her folder. Across the room, Eleanor Hayes continued watching carefully. Unlike everyone else, she never looked away. Her expression revealed neither approval nor criticism. She simply observed. The moderator shifted uneasily in his seat. The atmosphere had become tense. Everyone understood that something inappropriate had just happened, but nobody seemed willing to challenge the CEO directly. Nia took a slow breath. Then another. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but steady. "That is exactly why I came." Richard blinked. Several people looked up. Nia continued. "The students I interviewed are serious. The teachers I spoke with are serious. The families trying to help their children succeed are serious." The room grew noticeably quieter. Richard's smile faded slightly. "I understand that," he replied. "But business is complicated." Nia nodded respectfully. "That is why I spent 6 months collecting data." A few investors exchanged glances. 6 months was longer than many expected. "I did not come here because I wanted attention," Nia continued. "I came because I found a problem and worked on a solution." The silence deepened. For the first time since entering the room, people were listening to her instead of looking at her backpack. Eleanor slowly closed the folder in front of her and folded her hands together. Her attention remained fixed on Nia. Richard glanced around the table and seemed to realize the room's mood was changing. Yet he still appeared unconvinced. "Very well," he said. "You have the floor." Nia looked toward the presentation screen. Her heart was still racing, but the fear was beginning to disappear. She clicked to her first slide. What happened next would force everyone in that room to confront something far more important than a backpack. The first slide appeared on the large screen behind Nia Carter, and something unexpected happened. Instead of colorful graphics or ambitious promises, the audience saw a simple photograph of 4 children sitting around a single aging laptop at a community center. The room grew quiet. Nia looked toward the investors and began speaking. "This is where my project started." Her voice remained calm. "These students share one computer after school because they do not have one at home." She clicked to the next slide. Charts appeared showing technology access gaps across several neighborhoods. Then came survey results from teachers, parents, and students. Every number had a source. Every claim had supporting data. The investors who had been casually checking phones or reviewing notes moments earlier were now paying attention. Nia explained how limited access to technology affected homework completion, coding education, and future career opportunities. More importantly, she explained how existing solutions often cost too much to reach the communities that needed them most. Richard Coleman remained silent, watching from his seat near the head of the table. His earlier confidence seemed unchanged, but several people around him were no longer looking in his direction. They were watching the screen. Nia continued. She presented a model built around refurbished computers, local partnerships, volunteer mentorship programs, and low-cost maintenance plans. Every step had been researched. Every estimate had been calculated. Every recommendation had been tested through interviews and pilot surveys. The further she progressed, the more the atmosphere shifted. Investors began taking notes. Executives started asking for copies of her research. One consultant leaned toward a colleague and whispered something while pointing at the financial projections. Nia noticed none of this at first. She was focused entirely on delivering the presentation she had spent months preparing. Then a hand rose from the far side of the room. "How many students could your pilot program serve in its first year?" an investor asked. Nia answered immediately. Another investor asked about operating costs. She answered that too. A third asked how the model could expand to other cities. Once again, she had an answer. The questions kept coming. So did the answers. What had started as skepticism was slowly becoming curiosity. Across the table, Eleanor Hayes watched the exchange with growing interest. She occasionally glanced at Richard, who seemed increasingly uncomfortable. The CEO had expected a brief presentation. Instead, he was watching a 10-year-old command the attention of people who rarely impressed easily. Then Nia reached her final slide. It contained a sentence she had written months earlier during her research. "Talent is everywhere. Opportunity is not." The room became silent. Nobody rushed to speak. Nobody checked their phones. For several seconds, investors simply looked at the screen. Then Eleanor Hayes slowly stood from her chair. Every eye turned toward her. She was one of the most respected investors in the room. Her opinion carried enormous weight. Nia felt her pulse quicken as Eleanor stepped forward slightly and looked first at the presentation, then at the young girl who had created it. The next words spoken inside that conference room would begin changing the balance of power completely. For several seconds after Eleanor Hayes stood up, nobody spoke. The silence carried a different feeling than before. Earlier, the room had been quiet because people were uncomfortable. Now it was quiet because people were thinking. Eleanor slowly looked around the conference table before returning her attention to Nia Carter. "How old are you?" she asked. 10, Nia replied. A few investors exchanged surprised looks. Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. "And how long have you been working on this project?" "About 6 months." More whispers spread through the room. Eleanor glanced down at the financial projections displayed on the screen. "Did anyone help you build these models?" Nia shook her head. "My teachers helped me understand some concepts, but I collected the data and built the proposal myself." Eleanor smiled slightly. "It shows." That single sentence carried weight. People listened when Eleanor Hayes spoke. Her reputation had been built through decades of evaluating ideas, companies, and leaders. If she was impressed, others paid attention. Several investors immediately began reviewing the printed materials again. Richard Coleman remained silent. The CEO's expression had become noticeably more serious. The room that had once followed his reactions now seemed focused elsewhere. Eleanor stepped closer to the presentation screen. "What interests me most," she said, "is not the proposal itself." A few heads turned. "It is the discipline behind it." She pointed toward the research. "Most people identify problems. Far fewer spend months gathering evidence before proposing solutions." Nia listened quietly. She had never imagined someone like Eleanor Hayes discussing her work in front of an entire room of executives. The investor continued. "You interviewed families. You collected data. You tested assumptions. You measured costs." She looked directly at Nia. "That is how serious innovation begins." Several investors nodded in agreement. One executive requested additional copies of the proposal. Another asked if the pilot survey data could be shared electronically. Momentum was building. Nia could feel it. More importantly, everyone else could feel it too. Then an investor seated near the middle of the table raised his hand. "I have a question." Eleanor gestured for him to continue. "Based on these numbers, why has nobody explored this model before?" The room became quiet again. It was a fair question. Nia considered her answer carefully. "I think sometimes people focus on what is profitable before they focus on what is possible." A few investors looked at one another. The observation was simple, but it landed with surprising force. Eleanor slowly smiled. "That may be one of the most honest answers I have heard all year." More laughter followed, but this time it was warm rather than uncomfortable. Richard shifted slightly in his chair. For the first time all day, he appeared disconnected from the direction of the conversation. Nia noticed it too. Earlier, every comment seemed to come from him. Now discussions were happening around him. The center of attention had changed. Then Eleanor turned toward Richard. Her expression remained calm, but her next question immediately altered the atmosphere. "Richard," she said, "before this presentation began, did you actually review her proposal?" The room instantly fell silent. Every eye moved toward the CEO. And for the first time that day, Richard Coleman looked like the person being evaluated. The question lingered over the conference table like a sudden storm cloud. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Every investor, executive, and consultant in the room looked toward Richard Coleman. Just moments earlier, he had been the most powerful voice in the room. Now he sat alone at the center of everyone's attention. Eleanor Hayes remained standing, waiting patiently for an answer. Richard cleared his throat. "I reviewed the summary," he replied. The response sounded less confident than usual. Eleanor tilted her head slightly. "The summary?" she asked. "Not the full proposal?" Richard shifted in his chair. "There are many submissions. I trusted my team to handle the details." Several investors exchanged looks. The explanation did not seem to satisfy anyone. Eleanor glanced toward the stack of documents in front of her. "That is interesting," she said calmly, "because the details appear to be where the value is." A few people nodded. Nia Carter remained quietly beside the presentation screen. She had not expected the conversation to move in this direction. She had come hoping only for a chance to present her work. Now the room seemed focused on something much larger than her proposal. One investor near the end of the table spoke up. "I reviewed the financial projections during the presentation." He tapped the pages in front of him. "The numbers are surprisingly strong." Another investor agreed. "The implementation costs are lower than several projects we funded last year." A third investor added, "The community partnership model is realistic." That caught my attention. With each comment, the atmosphere shifted further. Investors who had barely noticed Nia at the beginning of the meeting were now discussing her proposal as a legitimate business opportunity. Richard listened silently. The momentum was no longer under his control. Then Eleanor asked another question. "How many of you would have taken this proposal seriously if you had only evaluated the person presenting it rather than the work itself?" No one answered immediately. The silence was revealing. Everyone understood the point she was making. Nia looked down briefly at her worn navy backpack. Earlier that morning it had seemed like a source of embarrassment. Now she realized something important. The backpack had never been the problem. The assumptions people made about it were. Eleanor turned toward the investors. "Leadership is not measured by how we treat people who impress us," she said. "Leadership is measured by how we treat people before we know what they can offer." The words landed heavily across the room. Several executives lowered their eyes. Others sat back thoughtfully. Even those who had remained silent during Richard's earlier remarks now appeared uncomfortable. The room was no longer evaluating Nia's proposal. It was evaluating values, judgment, and leadership itself. Richard folded his hands together. For the first time all day, he seemed unsure what to say. Then a senior investor closed his folder and spoke. If this is how promising ideas are dismissed before being reviewed, we may have a larger problem than one presentation. The statement changed everything. Several heads immediately turned toward him. Eleanor did not respond. She did not need to. The question now hanging in the room was far more serious than anyone had expected when the meeting began. And as investors began quietly discussing among themselves, Richard suddenly realized that the real evaluation was only beginning. The discussions that had started as quiet whispers were no longer whispers. Around the conference table, investors openly exchanged opinions while executives reviewed documents with a level of attention that had been missing earlier in the day. Nia Carter stood patiently near the presentation screen, unsure what to do next. The focus of the room had moved far beyond her proposal. What had begun as a simple youth innovation presentation was now exposing something much deeper about leadership, judgment, and trust. Richard Coleman remained seated at the head of the table, listening as conversations unfolded around him. For years, people had accepted his decisions without question. Today was different. The confidence that usually surrounded him seemed noticeably weaker. Then Eleanor Hayes slowly returned to her seat. She folded her hands and looked directly at the group of investors. "I would like to ask a simple question," she said. The room immediately became quiet. "How many of you invest only in ideas?" Nobody raised a hand. Eleanor nodded. "Exactly. We invest in people. We invest in judgment. We invest in leadership." Several investors agreed. One nodded thoughtfully while reviewing Nia's proposal. Another leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. Eleanor continued. "The quality of this proposal matters. The potential impact matters. But what happened before this presentation matters too." The room remained silent. Nobody interrupted her. "Every leader in this room will eventually encounter someone who does not look important," she said. "Someone without influence. Someone without status. Someone without resources." Her gaze briefly moved toward Nia. "The real test is how we treat that person before we discover their value." The words seemed to settle heavily over the conference table. Nia noticed several executives looking down at their notes. Others avoided eye contact entirely. The lesson was impossible to ignore. A senior investor cleared his throat. "I agree." Another immediately followed. "So do I." Then a third voice joined the conversation. "The proposal is impressive, but I am equally concerned about the decision-making process that almost prevented us from hearing it." More heads nodded. Richard finally spoke. "I think we are losing perspective." His voice remained calm, but there was tension beneath it. One unfortunate comment should not overshadow years of successful leadership. Eleanor listened carefully before responding. "Nobody is questioning past success." She paused. "We are discussing present judgment." Once again, silence filled the room. The distinction was important. Success and judgment were not always the same thing. Then something unexpected happened. One investor slowly closed his presentation folder and stood up from his chair. The movement immediately drew attention. "I have great respect for this company," he said. "But trust is essential to every partnership." Another investor followed. Then another. Nobody was angry. Nobody raised their voice. Yet each person who stood sent the same message. Confidence had been damaged. The room that once revolved around Richard Coleman was beginning to move away from him. Nia watched in disbelief. She had arrived carrying nothing more than a backpack and a proposal. Now some of the most influential people in the room were making decisions that could affect the future of an entire company. And as more chairs quietly slid backward across the floor, Richard realized that the consequences of a few careless words were becoming far larger than he had ever imagined. The sound of chairs moving across the polished floor seemed louder than anything else in the room. One investor after another quietly gathered documents, closed folders, and stepped away from the conference table. Nobody was making a dramatic statement. Nobody was trying to create a scene. Yet the message was unmistakable. Trust had been shaken. Nia Carter stood beside the presentation screen, watching events unfold with a mixture of disbelief and uncertainty. Earlier that morning, she had worried about whether anyone would even listen to her idea. Now some of the most influential people in the room were reconsidering their relationship with a company because of what they had witnessed. Richard Coleman looked around the conference suite as if searching for a way to regain control of the conversation. For years, investors had followed his vision. Today, for the first time, many seemed willing to question it. "I think everyone is overreacting," Richard said. His voice remained steady, but the confidence behind it sounded thinner than before. "We are discussing a misunderstanding that happened during a busy presentation schedule." Several investors exchanged glances. Eleanor Hayes remained seated, calmly reviewing Nia's proposal. Then she looked up. "A misunderstanding?" she asked. The room became quiet again. Richard nodded. "Yes, an unfortunate moment." Eleanor closed the folder and placed both hands on the table. "No, Richard." Her voice was calm, but every word carried weight. "A misunderstanding happens when information is unclear. What happened today was different." Nobody interrupted. "You made a judgment before reviewing the work. You evaluated the person before evaluating the idea." The distinction landed heavily throughout the room. Nia lowered her eyes briefly. Hearing someone finally describe exactly what had happened felt strangely emotional. She had not come seeking validation, yet it mattered that someone understood. One investor who had already stood paused before leaving. "That is what concerns me," he said. "If an excellent proposal can be dismissed because of assumptions, how many other opportunities have been overlooked?" Another investor slowly nodded. "And how many talented people never received a chance to be heard?" The questions hung in the air unanswered. Richard opened his mouth to respond, but stopped. There was no simple explanation. Across the table, executives who had remained silent during the earlier remarks now seemed uncomfortable. Some reviewed notes. Others stared out the windows overlooking the city skyline. The atmosphere had completely transformed. Then Eleanor turned toward Nia. "Young lady," she said warmly, "there is something remarkable about your project." Nia looked up. "The technology matters. The numbers matter. The business model matters." Eleanor smiled. "But what impressed me most was your decision to stay." The room listened carefully. Many adults would have walked away after being embarrassed publicly. Nia thought about that moment. She had wanted to leave. She had wanted to disappear. But she had stayed because the project mattered more than her feelings. Eleanor seemed to recognize that. "That kind of resilience cannot be taught easily," she continued. Several investors nodded in agreement. Then Eleanor stood once more and looked around the room. What she said next would open a door Nia never imagined possible and permanently alter the direction of her future. The room remained completely silent as Eleanor Hayes looked around the conference table. Every investor, executive, and advisor seemed to understand that something important was about to happen. Nia Carter stood quietly beside her presentation screen, still holding the folder that had started the entire chain of events. Her worn navy backpack rested beside her chair. It looked exactly the same as it had that morning. Yet somehow everything felt different now. Eleanor smiled warmly at Nia before turning toward the investors. "I have spent more than 30 years evaluating opportunities," she said. "Most people think the hardest part is identifying great ideas." She shook her head slightly. "It is not. The hardest part is recognizing potential before everyone else sees it." Several investors nodded. They knew the truth of that statement better than anyone. Eleanor lifted Nia's proposal from the table. "This project deserves support." The words seemed to brighten the room instantly. Nia blinked in surprise. She had hoped people would listen. She had never expected someone like Eleanor Hayes to publicly champion her work. More importantly, Eleanor continued, "The person behind this project deserves an opportunity." She then turned directly toward Nia. "If you are willing, I would like my foundation to help develop this program further." For a moment, Nia thought she had misheard. The room around her seemed to disappear. All she could think about were the children she had interviewed, the teachers who had encouraged her, and the months she had spent collecting information after school and on weekends. "You mean the project could actually happen?" she asked softly. Eleanor smiled. "That is exactly what I mean." Several investors immediately began discussing partnerships and pilot locations. Others offered technical resources, mentorship programs, and educational contacts. The conversation was no longer about whether Nia's idea had value. It was about how quickly it could be implemented. Nia felt tears gathering in her eyes, but blinked them away. Across the room, Richard Coleman remained seated. The confidence that had defined him throughout the morning was gone. He watched as support gathered around the very proposal he had dismissed. For the first time, He seemed to understand the full impact of what had happened. Eventually, he stood. The room became quiet once more. Richard looked toward Nia. "I owe you an apology," he said. There was no defensiveness in his voice. "No excuses. I judged you before I understood your work." Nia listened carefully. "And I was wrong." The apology was simple, but it felt sincere. Nia nodded respectfully. She had not come seeking revenge. She had only wanted a fair chance to be heard. Eleanor glanced around the room one final time. "Today was never really about a proposal," she said. "It was about a choice." People listened closely. Every person here had the opportunity to decide whether appearance mattered more than substance, whether assumptions mattered more than facts, and whether status mattered more than truth. The words settled across the conference suite. Nobody disagreed. As the meeting ended, investors continued discussing Nia's project while sunlight streamed through the towering windows overlooking Chicago. Nia picked up her old backpack and prepared to leave. It was still worn. It was still ordinary. But now it carried something new. Not just research papers and notes. It carried a future that had once seemed impossible. And as she walked toward the elevator, she realized that the most powerful thing she brought into that room had never been inside the backpack at all. It had been the courage to stay when everyone expected her to leave.